Gotcha.
Yep, so we're ready to go.
Yeah, hello, I'm Dora Thorsten from IDS, Research Fellow here, and I work on children's and young people's migration and work. I'm very pleased to welcome Jessica Taft for today's seminar. Before going to introducing Jessica properly, I should say that if there's a fire alarm, we need, us who are in this room, need to go out of this door in the corner. But we normally don't have fire alarms, but just in case. And then let me get to the more interesting part, and fire alarms are not interesting, and it is to introduce Professor Jessica Taft, who is working at the University of California in Santa Cruz, and is part of the Latin American and Latino Studies group. Jessica is the author of several books, and the latest one is The Kids Are in Charge, which is about what she was talking, is the topic of her talk today. But before that, she's also been writing on rebel girls, of girl activists, both in North and South America. She works on these research across the categories of children and youth, which is really productive in the unsettling of categories and in testing the narratives and ideas that are deeply normative about girls, about children, about youth. And it's really this movement between childhood, adolescence, youth, gender identities, and the political or activist identities that are very interesting in Jessica's work. So apart from the two books, she's also published widely in various journals, both on girlhood, but also childhood and youth, again on activism and identity. So without further ado, I would like you to give your talk and tell us interesting stuff about your work in Peru.
Super. Thanks
so much, Bertha. And thanks also for hosting me, and I also thank Michelle for getting me here. I am very happy to be here talking to a few people in an in-person room. And it's nice to know that there are some of you watching from elsewhere, wherever that may be. But it's fun to actually be in a room talking about this work. I'm going to talk mostly about research from my fairly recent-ish 2019 book on the Peruvian movement of working children, which I didn't get to do very many book talks on. There was a pandemic, so it's great to finally be able to talk about it with people, as I was saying. But I'm also going to sort of extend beyond that book a little bit to some of my newer thinking that I've been doing in response to what I see as a kind of reanimated public interest in young people's activism that we've seen in the past couple of years. So while some politicians and pundits respond to young people's activism with outright dismissals, others offer patronizing and overly effusive praise, more journalists, parents, teachers, and NGOs are also starting to ask, what can we, as adults, do to support young activists? What might they want or need from us? What does it mean to act in solidarity with activist children? And what's the appropriate role for adults in child and youth-led movements? And I think these are really good questions, but I think they're also much more thorny than many of the people who ask them imagine them to be. As you'll hear today, the Peruvian movement of working children has been striving to build an intergenerational, horizontal, but kid-led social movement for over 40 years. And so this movement gives us a powerful model with many inspiring and effective practices, but it also provides an opportunity to identify the very real challenges to collaborative intergenerational activism. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about this movement, which is going to be the sort of focus of my analysis. So the Peruvian movement of working children was founded in 1976, so quite some time ago. It's made up of multiple organizations, and it involves at this point somewhere around 10,000 niños y adolescentes trabajadores, or what they call NATs. The NATs are between the ages of 8 and 17, The vast majority of them are between 11 and 15 for some reasons that I'll talk about a little later. It's pretty gender balanced. They come from poor and working class families, and they're involved in a wide variety of work practices. They work on family farms, they work in family market stalls and small businesses. They may street vend, either alone or with family or with others. They work as porters, carrying things in the markets. And many of them provide help around the house. They do domestic reproductive labor that they didn't necessarily even think of as work until they began participating in the movement. So they sort of come to identify as workers partly through the movement itself. So they're mostly working either in the informal economy or in household economies. They're also all in school, which is important to note. I think most people's perception of who is a child worker is very different than what the reality of most child work actually is. These kids are all in school, which is also the case for most working children in Peru. It's not actually unique to these particular working kids, but it's actually quite common. The movement is organized into base groups. Each base group has somewhere between 5 and 25 nuts. Each base group also has at least one adult supporter, which they call a colaborador, who works closely with them. The base groups are organized into regions. The regions are organized into a national level of coordination, and then there are frequent opportunities for international coordination and collaboration across Latin America. And there are sort of three main elements to their political vision or their agenda, what they're trying to accomplish. The first is that in contrast to abolitionist approaches that call for an end to child labor, they emphasize working children's leadership on the issue and the need to end the exploitation of children and work that's harmful to children, rather than abolishing or criminalizing all forms of children's work. I'm happy to talk more about this position. They call it valoración crítica or critical appreciation during the Q&A period, but it's not really the focus of what I'm going to talk about today. So that's one element, critical appreciation of children's work. The second element is a sort of counter-hegemonic perspective on childhood itself. This is really captured by the concept of protagonismo, an idea that was initially constructed in relationship to the concept of protagonismo popular, which is a term used in the 1960s and 1970s in Latin America to describe how poor people, neighborhood groups, women's groups, unions, indigenous groups, and others were claiming space as protagonists or as central actors who are able to shape the story of the national political scene. It described activism and political agency of these groups, their collective power, their sense of collective identity as a political bloc. And so from this lineage, protagonismo refers to a social group, especially a marginalized social group, coming to see its own significance and claiming space in the political field. So for the movement of working children, this has meant discussing how children are an oppressed social group that's been excluded from power, often with paternalistic justifications, and then arguing that that exclusion is unjust. So sometimes people think that protagonismo is kind of equivalent to agency. It is definitely not. It is much more kind of collective and power charged theory, I would say, of childhood. And then finally, the third major element in their political vision is the idea of intergenerational horizontalism, or the idea of transforming and equalizing the power dynamics of adult-child relationships, or reducing hierarchy, creating more egalitarian ways of interacting across age differences. And this is a subject I'm going to come back to in much more detail in a minute. And so to accomplish these political goals, they do a variety of different kinds of activities. Some of this is kind of individualized support work for individual nuts. Some of it is political education work, consciousness raising, critical sort of Freirean education on a variety of issues. And some of it is organizing and campaigns, either of their own kind of initiatives or in solidarity with other movements and organizations. So in the book, I argue that this movement directly challenges 5 widespread assumptions about childhood. What I refer to as first, the binary difference assumption, or the assumption that children and adults are essentially or fundamentally different kinds of humans. The natural assumption, or the assumption that childhood is a natural or universal category with fixed traits and characteristics. The passivity assumption, or the assumption that children are just uncritical sponges who absorb the perspectives of adults. The exclusion assumption, or the assumption that children should be prevented from participation in both work and politics. And then the power assumption, or the assumption that adults' power over children is just, inevitable, or necessary, and therefore should not be diminished. And so I tracked the sort of ways that they counter these different assumptions by first articulating the movement's conceptualization of childhood as a space of social, political, and economic subjectivity and engagement. Then I mapped their multiple interpretations of intergenerational equality, what that concept means to them. And then shifting from discourse to practice, I look at the interpersonal relationships between adult colaboradores and the NATs, focusing on the tension between the goal of horizontalism and the practice of teaching that's actually embedded in the role of the colaborador. And then I look at the ways that different colaboradores manage these particular dynamics, this particular kind of role conflict in relationship to their own aged, gender, racialized, and class identities. Chapter 5 then zooms in on issues of decision-making authority and power in the movement and really highlights the complex role of adolescence in the movement. And then finally, in chapter 6, I take a kind of wider view to look at the impacts of the movement on Peruvian childhoods writ large and on working children's lives outside of the movement context. Today, I'm going to focus just on some of the dynamics around challenging age-based power that really ground chapters 3 and chapter 5, but I'm happy to answer questions about anything else during the Q&A, of course. So my analysis is based on over 12 months of fieldwork conducted between 2012 and 2017, mostly in and around Lima, Peru's capital. And in addition to extensive ethnographic observation at a wide variety of public and private movement activities, which mostly means meetings. If you study social movements, that means you basically study a lot of meetings. It's not just the kind of flashy things that people assume that movements do. It's a lot of meetings, a lot of planning. So in addition to that kind of observation of how those dynamics work in these different spaces, I draw on some semi-structured in-depth interviews with 9 adults and 13 children who are part of the movement, as well as an analysis of websites, publications, flyers, pamphlets, training manuals, proclamations, and other kinds of movement materials. I take both a feminist and Foucauldian approach to power. I'm not trying to assess power as a quantity or to ask who has more and who has less, but instead to try to look at the distribution and operation of different modalities or forms of power. The goal is to move beyond simplistic binaries of children as either active or passive, liberated or oppressed, independent or manipulated, by instead delineating how multiple forms of power and authority are produced, negotiated, and contested by both children and adults. Further, I take an intersectional perspective. Age-based power intersects and interacts with, but also operates differently from other axes of social difference: gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, and so on. So when analyzing intergenerational relationships in the context of social movements, I try to think with and alongside the work of US feminists of color and transnational feminists who've written extensively about the challenges of creating political coalitions across lines of difference and inequality. All right, that is more than enough background. So let's get into some details about how this movement helps us think about age-based power. So articulated sometimes with a concept of igualdad, or equality, and sometimes through the idea of horizontalidad, or horizontalism, movement participants express very deep commitments to transforming and equalizing the power dynamics of adult-child relationships. At the level of discourse or ideology, they really emphasize 3 main points that are their sort of fundamental values that undergird that political vision. The first is the idea of the fundamental equal worth, dignity, and humanity of children and adults. They are both seen as fundamentally dignified and equal. The second is the position that everyone is still learning and growing, and that everyone, no matter their age, is capable of learning and growing in new ways. So kids can be equally capable as adults. It all depends on their opportunities to learn something. And so I think about this a lot in terms of the idea that no one is born knowing how to facilitate a meeting. You have to learn how to facilitate a meeting. And an 8-year-old who starts learning that at 8, by the time they're 12, may be very, very good at facilitating a meeting. But a 30-year-old who's never facilitated a meeting may have 0 skills at this, right? The capacity is not tied to chronological age. The third point that they make as kind of fundamental belief about equality is the idea of equality of insight. That children have distinctive knowledge, expertise, and insights to offer, and that their ideas should be valued and taken just as seriously as those of adults. So then these 3 kind of core beliefs basically challenge assumptions about adult superiority, and they really question the relevance of chronological age as a criterion for value. And in this sense, they provide a kind of ethical foundation for the movement's aspirational vision of horizontalism, right? That these are the things that they're imagining to be true so that then they can move toward horizontalism. But how does horizontalism work? What does it actually look like? Overall, the move toward horizontalism is embodied through relational practices where children and adults work together on a shared social movement agenda while treating each other with deep mutual respect and care. The adult colaboradores consistently acknowledge and treat children as active subjects who are capable of critical thinking and analysis. The Nats engage regularly in meaningful political dialogue and strategic planning with adults who they know are going to listen to them, respect them, and take their ideas seriously, even when they disagree. They're attentive to the quality of these relationships and are very reflective and self-critical about the extent to which they are, in fact, disrupting these conventional age-based hierarchies. But this kind of discursive and relational foundation doesn't necessarily mean that age-based power is entirely absent or erased from the movement dynamics. So then how does it manifest? And here I find it helpful to try to look at how age-based power takes different forms or different kind of modalities. I'm going to start by talking about disciplinary power. So in the regional and national assemblies, the Nats vote on who's going to be their regional and national colaboradores, their adult supporters for a given term. And in the lead up to that vote, the Nats discuss the traits that they think are important in a colaborador, what they like, what they don't like about particular colaboradores who are up for this election. And then they decide which adults they think are best suited to support them and their work. I only saw this process unfold once, and that time it was pretty painless, but I had a lot of Nats tell me that it can actually be really tense and uncomfortable for their colaboradores, as a whole room full of kids is saying what they like and don't like about each of them. In the practice, though, we can really see one way that the movement tries to increase children's formal authority within the movement. It makes individual adults' participation, especially in the kind of key decision-making and strategic planning sites of the movement, right, these regional and national coordinating bodies, entirely dependent upon kids' approval and affirmation. The kids get to decide if those adults get to stay in that space or not. And so it should be obvious that this kind of power is not actually that common in intergenerational spaces. Young people don't usually hire the staff for most community-based organizations that cater to them. Kids don't get to select the mentors or tutors who are going to serve them in various after-school programs. So this is distinctive. And it's an innovation that the Nats really appreciate. One young woman said to me, if we don't like what the adults are doing, we get to replace them. And they do. So another kind of formal authority, though, that they have that disrupts traditional norms for adult-child interactions centers around rulemaking, who makes the rules. Colaboradores sometimes remind kids to pay attention. They occasionally separate kids who are being disruptive by talking or having side conversations. They may intervene in various small fights between kids, but they never mete out any kind of punishments or consequences for children's actions. There's no detentions, no timeouts, no extra tasks given for misbehavior from the adults. Instead, the kids themselves are in charge of any systems of discipline that they want to create. So in one base group, for example, I saw this happen a couple of times. There have often been problems with kids not coming regularly to the weekly assemblies, which are supposed to be the kind of key part of the movement activities. And so at 2 different assemblies and 2 different ideas, or in 2 different years, the kids decided that to better motivate their peers to attend, they would start imposing fines on people who had unexcused absences. They said they were going to charge a fine of 3 soles and then prohibit them from participating in the movement's activity that week. 3 soles is quite a bit for a working kid. It's about $1, but it's like not insignificant in these kids' lives. Now, it was never actually clear to me if the kids ever implemented this punishment, but the important thing, I think, is that they themselves were being set up as, and saw themselves as, the arbiters of acceptable and unacceptable behavior in the movement. And so this displaces some of that kind of authority from adults who usually have this sort of power over children. And this allows adults and kids in the movement to have a relationship that is in no way tied to the dynamics of rule enforcement, while also encouraging kids to feel responsible for and to each other. So these 2 practices really formalize children's collective authority over adults and over each other, especially in terms of the power to determine inclusion and exclusion from certain spaces, and the power to institute and enforce norms of behavior. So in this particular modality, we can see how the movement of working children flips a more common intergenerational power dynamic. But social movements are not just locations for interpersonal relationships. They're also essentially deliberative spaces. Activists have to discuss their visions and their goals, and they have to make decisions about strategies and tactics. So in these particular contexts, questions about the power of speech and who speaks is pretty important. I published a lot more on this particular modality of age-based power dynamics than on the others. So I'm going to just be really, really brief here and note that while children's speech is very actively encouraged in a whole variety of ways within the movement, and children have abundant opportunities to express themselves, there's still a dynamic in which adults talk too much, as the kids say, in many key conversations, and that this is the result of a very persistent and hard to disrupt intergenerational habitus or habituated behavior of adults speaking first and kids listening. But how different people are heard within the movement is also shaped by their age. Although adolescents are usually more confident in their self-expression, they speak more often, younger kids' voices have substantial symbolic power in the movement. Because the movement has these discourses about the value of childhood, not just youth or adolescence, and about the value of children's insights, when the youngest children speak up, everyone listens very, very carefully. So a key part of the movement's ideology about being child-led then gives the youngest kids a certain kind of additional authority because of this kind of questioning of chronological age that happens. But while kids' voices have a lot of power, many kids also note that they listen to the opinions of the adult colaboradores because they, quote, know more. As Andres, a 12-year-old boy, said, quote, their opinion is important to us. They support us and they have more experience. They're older already. And this view is really supported by a frequent practice of adults giving the Nats what they call an orientation in advance of many decisions. So sometimes this orientation is just presenting information. So maybe the organization has been asked if they want to send representatives to an upcoming event. The collaborador has information about that event and they want to share that information. Sometimes it might be that they're describing the various players in an upcoming legislative debate. But the practice of collaboradores providing this kind of information, while it makes sense because of their longer movement histories, the kinds of knowledge and institutional positions that they sometimes hold, it also can make them appear to be sources of knowledge and not just a few pieces of information. And so it positions some kids then in a spot where they, especially the ones who are newer to the movement, will say things like, collaboradores orient us, respect our opinions, tell us what is good and tell us what is bad. Or they let us know what we're talking about, why we're talking about it, and what are the important things to focus on. They tell us what we should do. Now they would refuse that positioning quite a bit, right? The adults in the movement would be like, there is no way that we tell them what to do. That's not our job, that's not our role. But it's still the case that kids experience this provision of information sometimes as directing them and telling them what to do, right? It's messier than just the adults don't tell them anything in this sense, right? So, and this means that the kids continue sometimes to view adults as more knowledgeable and give their words additional weight in deliberations. So in thinking about the question of influence, a dynamic unique to age-based power begins to emerge. A complex but intractable relationship between age and experience. On the one hand, children's ideas are treated as important and are influential in the movement because of their present-day experiences. They know what it is to be a child right now. On the other hand, adults' contributions are valued because of their many years of experience with the movement and with political action. Both of these kinds of experience are seen as producing knowledge and as generating particular types of expertise. But expertise generated over time, which is expertise held by adults, is more generally valued in the larger social context. So unsurprisingly, this dominant perspective also filters into the movement interactions, with kids sometimes valuing adult ideas over those of their peers. Now, the relationship between age, experience, and expertise becomes even more tangled when we start to look at another modality of power, formal leadership. The Nats elect delegates to lead their base groups and to work in coordinating bodies at the regional, national, and international levels. And these delegates play a key role in planning movement activities, whether that's developing annual strategic plans or setting the agenda for the next meeting in assembly. In general, to be elected as a delegate at any level, you have to have 2 years of participation in the level you're representing. So 2 years in your base group before you become a regional delegate, 2 years as a regional delegate before you become a national one. And movement discourse generally rejects the idea that chronological age should be a marker of ability to do something. That rejection is key to their arguments against minimum age standards for children's work. And so instead of focusing on age, they emphasize experience, arguing that a 12-year-old with 4 years in the movement is just as likely to be able to take on leadership, right? So they emphasize those years of experience, but of course, years of experience are not distinct from age entirely, right? And in one regional assembly, I had a chance to observe the ways that the Nats talked about these things in combination when they were talking about who was ready to be elected as a regional delegate. And notably, chronological age continued to matter in these discussions in ways that continue to undercut the discourse that age is not important. The election of regional delegates, like the election of colaboradores, is preceded by a session during which the entire assembly of approximately 50 kids evaluates each delegate. Each group's base and regional delegates are asked to come forward one by one to stand and receive feedback. And many delegates of every age were complimented for being friendly, collaborative, responsible, and participatory. The younger delegates were praised for being enthusiastic, creative, or energetic, but they were sometimes told that they were, quote, not participating much, or that they were shy, and that, quote, this shyness is common when people are new, and I hope that when she gets more comfortable, she'll participate more. So these comments, hoping for greater participation in a young delegate's future, set up the younger delegates as still being early in their process, suggesting they don't yet have the experience that leads to a more participatory and vocal subjectivity. But in contrast to this type of commentary on younger kids, adolescents who were described as quiet were not generally being framed as shy or still learning how to participate. Instead, they were told by their peers that they needed to, quote, take on more responsibility or step up to meet what's expected of them. So the critiques offered to delegates of different ages suggest that kids themselves treat age as a relevant factor when analyzing each other's leadership. They may frame younger delegates' actions as resulting from a lack of experience, but they don't make the same case with older kids, even if those older kids may in fact also be brand new to the movement, as is sometimes the case. Older kids are expected to be more responsible, more focused, more participatory by their peers of various ages, no matter how much inexperience they have. In contrast, younger kids' quiet or their distractedness is usually explained by their inexperience rather than by their age, allowing movement participants to continue to argue that kids of all ages can be participatory leaders, they just need more experience. So age matters in what the kids say about each other, but it's also simultaneously denied as being significant for identifying leaders. Now, another important dynamic around age-based power emerges when we look at what happens when the Nats age out of the category and have to start ceding their formal leadership authority. So movement regulations are really clear that you cannot be a delegate after your 18th birthday. And depending on when your birthday is and its relationship to a 2-year election cycle, this means that many Nats actually can age out of leadership positions at around 16. So some of the former delegates who are not yet 18 sometimes stay very active in the movement, but others reduce their participation more slowly. But in any case, once they hit 18, an individual is no longer a Nat, and they have to transition to becoming a colaborador if they want to continue to be part of the movement. And at this time, there's a sharp break in their power and authority. They're expected to step back from outspoken leadership to begin to listen more, taking on this new role. And on the one hand, this profound shift in roles and responsibilities is somewhat arbitrary, right? The teen is not that different after their 18th birthday than they were right before it. But on the other hand, this clearly marked dividing line between kid and adult really requires the older teens to actively confront the increased power that they've accumulated over the years of their participation, and then to figure out how to give up that power and authority in order to keep the movement kid-led and to pass responsibility along to the next generation of Nats. And the challenge of learning to constrain one's participation can be substantial, but it's easier for those adolescents who already, in their later years in the movement, began to focus on encouraging the participation of younger kids. And notably, and perhaps unsurprisingly, The practice of encouraging the voices of younger nuts was by far more common amongst the teenage girls than the teenage boys. The girls were generally more reflective about the amount of power and influence they had gained over the course of their participation in the movement, and then they worked to reduce that authority over time. For girls, age-based power seemed to be treated as more of a continuum rather than simply a nat colaborador, child-adult binary. By seeing themselves as having more social power than younger kids, they also saw themselves as having a responsibility to minimize the effects of that power in the context of the movement. Their male peers, on the other hand, didn't do as much work bringing forward younger children's participation, instead continuing to develop their own individual leadership skills and capabilities. They also seemed much more likely to understand themselves as not having age-based power in the larger society, and therefore as being in the same position or shared position with younger children. So this is now one of the distinctive elements of intergenerational or cross-age alliances. People's relationships to the categories of child, youth, and adult change over time. These transitions, if they're clearly demarcated in some way, provide an opportunity for individuals to reflect on the workings of age-based power. So for delegates in the movement of working children, having the experience of holding substantial political power as a child and then learning to cede this particular power can be a challenge, but it also gives them a chance to reflect on their own adulthood as they enter it, and to carefully consider how they're going to interact with children as they age out of this category. So, what does all of this tell us then about the possibilities and challenges for building intergenerational social movements that include children as real partners in struggle? So first and most basically, the movement of working children makes abundantly clear that young people, including children as young as age 8, can make important contributions to social movements. When given an opportunity, they will gladly and effectively take on a variety of roles and responsibilities within activist spaces. Second, they show us that relationships between children and adults can be more equal or more horizontal than our dominant social norms. The nuts who participate in the movement describe it as a unique and counter-hegemonic space where they experience deep respect and meaningful power. As Graciela put it, in society, there isn't equality between adults and kids because the adult is seen as being above, seen as knowing more, and the kid is seen as below, as not being able to make his or her own decisions. The kid should just think and do what the adult says. But when you're in the movement, all this changes. It goes away. Now, while Graciela is correct to identify the movement as a place where the intergenerational power dynamic changes, and where adults are not always above kids, age-based inequalities also don't just go away. Instead, if we analyze the multiple modalities of power within the movement, we can see how difficult it can be to actually completely dismantle our hierarchical intergenerational habitus. Patterned and power-charged interactions rooted in a culture of adult dominance and children's marginalization are not just vanished from the space, but they continue to shape it in subtle ways. This is also not unique to the movement of working children. I don't read this as a failure, but rather as an inevitable challenge in any attempt at prefigurative, horizontalist political relationships across lines of difference and inequality. So, where does this leave me then when well-meaning adults ask, how can they best support young activists? On the one hand, there's some very specific things that young people say that they want from adult allies. Resources, both financial and not. Help accessing decision makers or authority figures. Institutional memory, particularly if an institution has agreed to something in the past but hasn't followed through on it yet. Logistical labor, amplification of their messages, and so on. These are the easy answers for how to support child and youth-led movements. But some young activists also say they want much more from adults. They want us to join them in their struggles, to work alongside them as partners in pursuit of shared political visions. And this, I think, is where we need much more learning and thinking. The theories and practices of intersectionality, anti-oppression organizing, and coalition building, most extensively developed by Black feminists, give us some really useful conceptual and practical tools for this work. And we can look to and learn from other movements and histories for guidance. But age-based power also operates with its own distinct logic, giving us new and particular challenges to navigate. We've talked about several of those dynamics already, but I want to open up a bit beyond what you can see in the ethnographic material. One thing that I've been thinking about and tracking a lot lately is the propensity to see any adult involvement in young people's movements as evidence of manipulation. Children, in particular, may be described as being pawns or used by adults. So in response, movements like the Peruvian movement of working children often bend over backwards to make the case that the kids are autonomous, they're in charge, they're doing it all on their own. And this profoundly impoverishes their ability to actually talk about how age-based power works. When adult collaborators and allies are constantly trying to avoid the accusation of using youth, they're forced to deny their contributions and claim that it's all just the kids, rather than actually engaging in a careful and critical discussion of their roles and responsibilities in these social movement contexts. And this zero-sum narrative is one that applies uniquely to intergenerational activism. Just an example, it would be unimaginable to claim that the presence of some white activists in the Black Lives Matter movement indicates that Black folks are being used to further the agenda of white individuals. So intergenerational activism is unlike many other coalitional approaches in a few other ways as well. The roles taken on by adults in these movements are often much more extensive than that normally associated with the idea of the ally or the accomplice. My co-author, Hava Gordon, and I have written some about how allyship, in fact, is not necessarily a very good description for what actually happens in intergenerational social movement spaces, where adults are more likely to take on key roles as funders, logistical coordinators, repositories of historical memory and continuity, trainers and educators, and even social workers. Children are not autonomous. They're often still dependent on adults for many political, legal, and economic reasons, and this matters quite a bit for our partnerships. So while there's currently a lot of enthusiasm about the idea of intergenerational social movements, and I am thrilled to see children being acknowledged as political actors and agents, I also see a need for much more analysis of how age-based power operates within and beyond social movements. And here I think is actually an area where childhood studies as an academic field can make a really powerful contribution, helping activists and advocates of all ages to develop our collective understanding of the operating logics and structures of age-based power, and therefore to think through how to disrupt these dynamics in our everyday interactions, as well as in our institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And then I'll open the floor to questions. If anybody has something on their tongue that they would like to ask, and you can raise your hands online and we'll make you available, make you live to ask questions as well, please. It was a very rich talk, so it
Takes a little bit to process.
takes a little bit to process.
No problem.
If we ask questions, do we need to go up to the mic or do we? Yeah.
Oh,
I'm gonna be brave and go first.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you.
Thank you very much for talk. I was very interested from a teacher's point of view about the age being very important, and then trying to challenge the, if you're 12 compared to 16. Is there perhaps influences outside of the movement? Perhaps I'm thinking like school and how we organize education. Do you think is influencing it, or what, I suppose my question is more, what do you think is influencing this? Keep going back to the age, yeah, focus.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think that a lot of it really does have to do with the larger social context that we're in, right? That it's when they participate in the movement, it is just one small slice of their lives in some ways, right? And so while it does invite all of this rethinking, they're also very much still embedded in a social world where there's countless claims about how age matters, right? That when you're 14, your brain is working in this way, and when you're 16, your brain is working in this way, right? Both like dominant media institutions, various interpretations of developmental psychology, schools, I think absolutely, right, are based on this idea that like 10-year-olds think this way and then 11-year-olds are ready for this, right? That so much of their lives are, as all of us, right, embedded in a world where we think that these age lines, that chronological age somehow does tell us something about capacity rather than learning opportunities as having told them things. Yeah, so it's hard to shake off our cultural contexts. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Really not liking that happen. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I had a question about kind of, you've already spoken about the context outside of where the children are participating in the movement. And I was wondering if you could actually talk about that a bit more, about kind of the contributing factors that have made the Peruvian children's movement kind of from the outside more successful than other attempts to have similar movements. I know there are other kind of organizations of working children's and working children's union, but they don't seem to have kind of the same expanse as the Peruvian movement.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there are a few things that have made the Peruvian movement particularly infrastructurally strong, right? That it is a lot about how much kind of organizational development has happened over the past 40 years to really produce a kind of stable infrastructure. And that, I think, partly comes from a few kind of key individuals who are particularly good at thinking about how do you build a sustainable and long-term children's movement. But also, I think the particular emergence there was really, really tied to liberation theology, right? Which is different than how the working children's movements emerged in India and the sort of West African and the larger kind of African movement of working children, right? Those histories are pretty different. And I think that the liberation theology history meant that there were also some initial infrastructural ties to the Catholic Church and to various comunidades de base, right? Sort of base communities and other kinds of organizational networks that meant that in those moments of struggle, when the infrastructure might have been weaker, right, there was already a little bit more of a set of institutions to rely on. I think the other thing is that they were very strategic in the moment of the internal conflict with the Shining Path, where many institutions and social movements in Peru really collapsed under threat, both from the government and from the Shining Path. And the movement of working children in that moment leaned heavily into an identity as a child rights organization, and started to draw more on the resources that were emerging internationally around children's rights support. So a little bit of the international NGOs, and they leaned harder into their identity as children rather than as workers and part of the working class, which was their original sort of main focus in the 70s and 80s, because that was much safer and more protective, right, than continuing to have a kind of workers movement in the moment of that internal conflict. And I think that also gave them a set of kind of infrastructural supports that have helped with that kind of continuity as well. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a long march across. It feels like a little strange. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a malformed question, but I'm really
Fine.
interested in the kind of protagonismo concept and also
Yeah.
the idea of kind of adultism as maybe the last acceptable form of social hierarchy, right? Which
Yeah.
someone comments on your book is kind of really clearly articulating
Yeah.
that. And I work a lot on kind of queer stuff, and I'm quite interested in how trans politics has managed to unpick some of the complex race issues in the South African context, for example, and how one might kind of leverage different social hierarchies to unpick others and how they're kind of all mutually implicated. And I wonder if you had something to say about that in relation to how this social movement might facilitate our learnings kind of in the feminist movement or?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's
I'm
super
sorry for
interesting.
that.
No, it's great. It's really, really interesting. I think that, I mean, I agree. I think that part of why I focus so much on age-based power is because I think when we look at how different structures of hierarchy work, it's helpful to actually help us see how other ones work, right? That like by thinking about both like, so, right, children in particular get positioned as, right, an acceptable group to marginalize, right? Mostly on the kind of logic of paternalism, we know what's best for them. But you can also see then when you focus on that argument about children, and then you can say, well, wait a second, children actually do know what's best for them, right, for themselves. And you challenge that, and you challenge the assumptions about childhood. It takes away this other crutch that is often used to marginalize other groups, right? To be like, oh, they're like children, right? We're doing what is best for them. I mean, Indigenous communities in particular have been marked as childlike, right, through the history of colonialism. And so one counter to that is to be like, oh, they're not like children. The other counter to that is to be like, well, children are fully capable subjects, right? So I think that the movement of working children, because of their challenge to the assumptions about childhood, can help sort of remove that other kind of technique that is used in some cases to marginalize other groups, right? So that's one element of it maybe. But I also think that when we focus on children, it draws attention to interdependencies in a way that's important, I think, for thinking about other movements, because I think because kids are so clearly not autonomous subjects in a certain way, right? That like they just can't be autonomous in the world that we live in as it is organized. Whether they could be in any world is an interesting question to think about, but they're clearly not in this world. And that orientation toward thinking about interdependencies, I think, helps us think about what liberation means in a world in which people are interdependent, rather than a kind of removal from a relationship. So that's useful. Yeah, I don't know. Super interesting stuff to think about, though. I think there's probably other things too.
Yeah, I found
I don't
that
know.
really in your book where you talk about the history of models of childhood.
Yeah.
Which you touched on in your first bit of the answer. I found that quite
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about when we talk about the interdependencies, we talk about them within the movement and how adults are there as facilitators. But if we think about interdependencies within the economy, within the household economy, where children are earning money that might go into the family or might go indirectly into the family through covering some of their own expenses and so forth, then I'm wondering if we're seeing interdependency in exactly the same way as if it's within the political scene. And then it sort of perhaps challenges a bit how we're thinking about interdependencies. I don't know if you have anything to add to that one.
That's very interesting too. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is where I think we need, it's always helpful to think about power, right? It's like, what are kids' powers in each of those spaces, right? What are they getting in terms of like leverage or freedom or the ability to influence others in the family in these interdependencies, right? And maybe that in the political realm, we're encouraged, or it sort of pushes us to think more about power as a starting place. But maybe we should also be thinking about power in the family context also, right? Yeah.
Any more? I had one tiny question. We're hoping that there's coming something from people online as well. But I had a small question that I was thinking of, the way that the children within the movement were issuing fines to other kids who are not coming. And I was thinking, where on earth did they get that from?
Yeah.
And they take in the context in Britain where schools or authorities are issuing fines when children are not coming to school, so the parents are issued fines. So do you have something similar? Where does this idea of issuing fines, where does it come from?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's some of the work that the folks who are involved in the Article 15 project did. So at CUNY, Roger Hart, and then a graduate student, Bijan, whose last name I'm blanking on right now, did some really, really interesting work looking at children's organizations globally and the different structures of children's organizations, and found that when children organize their own organizations, right, so Article 15 is children's right to self-organize. And so they were looking at how, when they do that, they tend to pick up, but also remake, right, using sort of a kind of interpretive reproduction model. They would sort of pick up organizational forms from the context around them and then make their own kind of tweaks on them, right? So absolutely, I think in this case, right, they're picking up on the fact that many other organizations and institutions will fine people for being late to something, right? Or they are like, this is one way that organizations work, right? So as they make their political organizations, they're sort of pulling from the contexts of other institutions. Yeah.
Can I talk from here?
I think you can.
Are there any kind of set forms for inculcating values of the movement, like, and do they differ kind of because of the generationalness?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of political education model is definitely, it's definitely Freirean, right? Like there's lots of like sitting and discussing problems and then synthesizing from that. And some colaboradores do more of that synthesis and take on that role as adults, and then often put things into the kind of vocabulary of the movement, right? And use that kind of space to encourage a kind of analytic way of seeing, right? And a familiarity with a set of terms. But also, right, kids in the movement certainly redefine those terms as well, right? They have ideas about what protagonismo is that are not what the adults say that it is, right? But the kind of sort of fundamental values around like shared dignity and respect, those are less, I would say they're less spoken about in the same way that sort of the kind of political analytic concepts are. And they get generated, I would say, more through a variety of very, very small and intentional choices made by the colaboradores around. So like, I think about naming a lot, right? The very intentional choice of saying like, here you call us by our first names, right? Which is not typical in the Peruvian context for sure, right? That like they would normally be, senor so-and-so, right? And so these kinds of very small sort of interactional differences, like refusal to punish, right? Like these kinds of things, I think, also really produce a kind of set of relations around some of those values. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm also gonna hang out here, if that's okay. Talking about kind of the intentional choices, sorry, it just made me remember, it's very, very rusty now, so I'm not gonna try. But in Spanish, you have the tú and the usted.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if
Yeah,
that's also like an intentional
Totally.
language choice that they make.
Totally, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of reminding, especially when kids are new to the movement. The colaboradores do a lot of reminding of them to use the tú form with them, right? To déjame, right? Like to use informal language with them, that they want to be peers in that space. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm also thinking of comparing to the African movement of working children, where some of the leaders are 18 or plus, and sort of growing older and older because they're not relinquishing the power to younger ones. I'm pretty impressed with the way they've been doing that in the Peruvian movement. But then looking at who's participating, who are members, and who do not see it as valuable. Looking at within the West African context, that a lot of the labor migrants, young adolescent labor migrants, are not going to spend money on becoming members of the movement because they have to pay towards it. They have small wages, and they don't believe that they will have anything to say or be given any words.
Benefit from it.
They don't benefit from it, basically. Do you have similar things with the migrants within Peru?
That's interesting. So the main sort of, I think, tension in Peru around the kind of like, which kids is this, which kids is it not, is the dynamics around kids who really live on the street. There's a different sort of thread of organization. So Mantok, I mean, Mantok is probably the biggest of the working children's organizations. And they, like, those kids are more often, right, they live at home, they work in a variety of different conditions. There's an organization called Generación that focuses much more on street-oriented kids. And there have been, they're both part of the larger movement, IDS-CIRCY, right, which is kind of umbrella organization. Both Generación and Mantok are part of that. But there have been times when there has been more tension between the Mantok and Generación, where some of the kids from Generación have felt like, because the movement of working children makes all of these arguments about how, like, oh, they're not the most exploited, they're not this image that you have in your mind of what working children are, they're also going to school, they're also doing all of these things. The street kids sometimes feel like they're put up as like a bad version of working children, or they're erased from the narrative, because the movement is doing all of this kind of work to say, like, working is fine, working, we work in our families, we work in these spaces. So there's a kind of tension around the image of the working child, where the more street-oriented kids sometimes feel like they're not as fully included in the movement's kind of narrative of who they are. Yeah, thank you.
What did you kind of recognize as a dominant motivation for involvement?
Yeah.
It's like quite a lot of work and time, right? Being involved in a social movement. Is it, and money also, presumably.
Less money. They don't pay dues or fees.
Okay.
Like, they're, so unlike some of the other ones, they don't actually pay in as kids into the base groups.
Yeah.
They sometimes raise money.
But you get fined if you're not.
Yeah, you might, but you might not actually. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm curious, is it a social thing? I mean, are they
Yeah.
perceived immediate benefits, or they more medium term or long term?
Yeah. It depends on the base group. So some of the base groups operate in these kinds of social centers where they have like a building, and there's like hot meals, and there's homework support, and there's like a variety of like immediate benefits, right? Workshops on things. They often have programs where they do kind of economic activity. Like they have the materials to design greeting cards, and then you can go out and sell the greeting cards, right? But those social centers are only a few of the base groups. And so there's like a clear immediate benefit, right? Most of the base groups are either rooted in neighborhoods. There's one that's part of rooted in a neighborhood that's a housing cooperative of a union of street cleaners, like the city street cleaners in one sub-district of Lima. Their housing cooperative has a base group. And then there's others that are tied to parishes, some that are tied to other neighborhoods. And for those, I think that the initial interest, right, is primarily social connection with other kids, right? And there's, I think in Latin America in general, Peru in particular, but Latin America in general, right? There's this idea of the value of being organized, right? That this notion of like what it is to be organized, and that to be part of an organized entity is also just seen as like a good thing, that one should be organized, whether you're doing anything about it or not, right? That like, just organization is a value. And so there's a way in which kids then can see like, oh, I'm doing this thing that is a value. I am of an organization, right? And then when I speak, I can speak as a member of that organization, and people listen in a different way, right? That there's a kind of authority that comes with that, which is a kind of somewhat immediate benefit, right? And then they definitely talk a lot about learning and like very strong sort of transformations around feelings of empowerment, right? And feeling like I actually can confidently say what I think, and people should listen to me. Like there's a very clear kind of transformation around speaking and the kind of power of speaking up. That's, I mean, among those who stay, right? There are definitely kids who leave, and I probably know less about them for sure, right? Sort of nature of the research. And there are kids who so part of the issue with like the assembly where they were doing fines is at one of the social centers. And so for them, the assembly is the political space of the movement. And the kids who are just going for the hot lunch and the homework help are the ones that the kids who are at the assembly are most wanting to get involved in the political space of the movement, right? So that's why they were threatening the fines, because they were like, you can't just come for homework and food, you have to talk about the issues with us and organize, right? That's like the other side of who we are, right? So they sort of don't want to just be seen as like any other program for social group, right? Yeah, for the folks who become sort of national delegates, who go on to kind of significant leadership, there's definitely at least some pretty significant anecdotal evidence of significant economic upward mobility, and also significant ongoing political engagement. So probably the most significant is like,
potential pathway to
yeah.
economic success.
Yep, because you've got, I don't think they necessarily think of that when they enter, right? But there become stories, right, that circulate of like, you know, X kid who through the movement got all of this additional support, was able to travel, right? Because they get to travel to speak at these UN things sometimes, or right, or like they have different kinds of collaborations with other organizations. They see something of the world, they, get support to do better in school, and then they go on, can imagine other futures and go on to college or university, or and some definitely continue to be politically involved. They had their first congressperson a couple years ago who came through the movement. So young indigenous woman from Ayacucho who started in the movement of working children and then was elected to the Peruvian Congress. So there's like also some sense of like a political path from it.
Do any of the people who are online, do you have any questions? No, I don't think so. It doesn't look like it. Do anybody else have a question or comment? Otherwise, we might just call it a day.
It's great.
Do you have anything more you want to say? Any of you?
We're whispering over here, but
Go
go
for
ahead.
it. So many questions.
You have to speak up or move to the microphone.
Sorry. I didn't do it wrong, but then you can correct me.
You can tag team the question. It's a collaborative question.
Collaborative question. This kind of connects to some of the earlier work you were doing on girls' political activism. And I was wondering kind of how you saw that within the Peruvian children's movement as well, and what role gender plays. And you were talking a little bit about the differences, but it'd be great to hear more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the girls in the movement, like the movement has a lot of language around gender equality. They try to have like gender balance in the various kinds of delegations at the different levels. And they are, I would say, fairly gender balanced, actually far more than most other young organizations that tend to be girl dominated, right? That I actually saw far more boys in this space than in my previous work, where I in like high school organizations where there's not a kind of explicit commitment to gender balance. There are mostly girls. And so I think that they've got a pretty clear language around gender and around a desire for kind of gender equality in the movement. The girls definitely, as I was saying, I do more of the kind of bringing in of the younger voices, which then, right, the kind of side effect of that is that their own voices as they age are also not as present as those of the boys, right? So because they're trying to be more collaborative and to pull in the younger kids, it turns out that then at that kind of higher level than at the kind of national level, the more centralized positions, that the young men, the teenage boys, tend to be a little bit more dominant in that space because the girls are working on bringing in other voices, right? So their kind of collaborative tendencies then actually end up kind of undercutting their presence in that space in some ways. The colaboradores, the dynamics around gender there are also really interesting, I think, because they use very different approaches to what it is to be a colaborador, right? That the women tend to kind of lean into more kind of caring roles. And there's a sense that the men in the movement are there more as like educators, or right, that there's a kind of gender divide in the kind of labor of the adults far more than in the kind of labor and practice of the young people. Yeah.
Is that what you see already at the end towards when they're beginning to sign off power in a way? So that's already that role
already
is coming up.
Yep.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got a question. What is the future of international cooperation for the movement of working children, for instance, in Africa, Asia, and America? So looking more broadly at these networks.
That's a great question. I think that, so I'll say just a little, like the project that I've just started, I'm trying to track a little bit the relationship between activists, kids and young people and children's movements and the INGOs, the International Children's Rights Organizations. And part of the history of the international cooperation between the working children's movements globally was that was really facilitated by funding and support from the INGOs. And many of them have in the past almost 20 years, 15 years at this point, really pulled back, 20 years, their engagement with the working children's movements. It's not absent, but it's much less than it was in the late 90s, which is when the kind of flourishing of the international cooperation between the working children's movements was happening. And so I think that the future for the working children's movements globally to collaborate really relies upon some resources, right? That like that kind of global collaboration needs there to be some kind of support for it, funding. Like as much as we say like, oh, people can do things on Zoom, right? Like people speak many different languages, you need translation. Like it's not actually easy to just have like Zoom conversations across all these regions. The other thing I think that has led to a kind of decline in the international cooperation and that limits where it's going is I think that the working children's movements are increasingly skeptical about their ability to influence the ILO, right? That they're sort of giving up in a certain sense on that particular aspect of the fight, right? That like part of why they were collaborating was to try to move the ILO on various conventions and to sort of change the narrative at these big global conferences to end child labor. And they keep getting shut out of those conferences. And so I think at a certain point, they've sort of been like, is this really worth our time? Or is it better to spend our strategic energy elsewhere? And so if you're spending your strategic energy elsewhere at the national level or at the local level, the kind of impetus for global cooperation across the movements, I think is reduced because there's just not as much drawing you to need to talk to each other about your strategy for that kind of global level work. So I think my sense is that they still see each other as allied, right? That there's a kind of like sense of being part of something with one another. They know about each other. Latin America still has a regional, Molacnats is the regional Latin American and Caribbean movement. And they still try to gather every couple of years and there's still kind of presence there at the regional level. But I think the collaboration across Africa, South Asia, and Latin America has really kind of fizzled.
It has fizzled, I think so too.
Yeah.
Philip, did you have any other questions or did it respond to what you wanted to hear about? Thank you, he says. Then I think we'll call it a day. And also on behalf of CIRCY, Michelle is saying, thank you so very much for your talk.
Thank you.
The sound was not always equally great through the talk. That's why people have been a little bit quiet on their questions because it's been difficult to follow everything all the time. But yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.